For those of you who haven't met, I'm Alex Scott. I'm the branch secretary of Together. Today we have a briefing on a range of public sector issues in relation to particularly those departments covered by the Core EB and the public areas. Some of the presentation will be relevant to other areas in terms of Queensland Health and Schools, but the majority of today's presentation is designed specifically for the core government departments. So thank you everybody for taking the time today. We do have quite a bit to get through. We'll try and make this as simple and clear as possible for people, but some of the content isn't clear to us in relation to where the state government is at, and I apologise that will make the presentation potentially not clear to you, but that's because potentially the information we're providing the government itself isn't clear with us as to exactly what's going on. So in terms of that process, well, can still see the main screen at this stage. So in terms of the major issues we wanted to cover today, we wanted to cover issues in relation to the savings and debt plan. We wanted to talk about issues in relation to your wages and collective bargaining, and also towards the end cover off issues in relation to the broader legislative reform process and what that looks like both in terms of the Public Service Act, Public Service Regulations and associated Public Service Commission directives. So in terms of the straight industrial issues, as we briefed a couple of weeks ago, the national wage case came down with a 1.75% increase to federal jurisdiction awards. Those wage increases are staggered. This year they came in 15th of July for most awards, and some of them are staggered for later awards in the private sector. Following that decision, Together has made the application to increase have a state wage case application to increase wages by 1.75% as at the 1st of September. For those people who are covered by the Core EB and within education, their wages are determined by their award at the moment. And so if the union is successful in its application, those workers should get an increase of 1.75% to your wages from the 1st of September. There are some other groups in Queensland Health and other areas where their collective bargaining agreements are higher than their award system, their award rates. And so their wages are determined by the collective agreement, so won't automatically get an increase on the 1st of September. In terms of the Core EB groups, because their wages are caught by the award, we've also then got a process in place under the EB that was just certified for the for a set of negotiations about whether or not your wages should be higher than the award, and if those wages are higher than the award, if those negotiations fail, we're in a position to then arbitrate later this year in kind of September, to whether the Industrial Relations Commission will want to set your wages above the award. So you'll almost certainly get an award increase. We believe it'll be 1.75. We believe it'll be from the 1st of September. Depending on how negotiations go over the next few weeks, we're likely to then run a secondary arbitration process, either to around the award wages issue, which then may set a secondary rate of wages above the award, which might mean a secondary flow on for other improvements in relation to wages. But the main thing we wanted to talk today about was in relation to the savings and debt plan. So there's been a number of announcements made by the previous Treasurer and by the current Treasurer over the last 6 months. Those have coalesced into a savings and debts plan, which has now been, is in the process of being implemented by the state governments and state government departments. Some of this work, we've had a number of meetings this week with central agencies about this issue, but also with a number of line agencies in relation to this issue. And we haven't got a consistent answer on exactly where these issues are at. But the presentation today is my assessment about where we think we're most likely to be at in terms of this process, and where we think we'll be likely to go to try and protect members' workloads and employment conditions and jobs over the next 6 to 12 months. So basically, prior to this year, there has been a FTE cap, a full-time equivalent cap, in terms of agencies. So while there's been a budget set each year, there's also been a decision by government that there will be a total number of full-time equivalents employed in each agency. In terms of that, then there has been the ability for agencies to get approval to go above that cap, but there has certainly been pressure, particularly outside of health and education, to try and reduce the size of the growth of the public service through the FTE cap. So health in particular has continued to grow over the last 5 years or so, but there has been more significant pressure in relation to agencies through, it's a budget principle number 6, it's been kind of addressed as the FTE cap. So the government's public position in relation to the savings and debt plan, and in terms of the document that you've got on the second half, you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen, is the kind of government's position, which is that the FTE cap hasn't changed. We haven't got a budget handed down for this financial year yet, but the kind of broad cap that exists, broad number that existed last year continues to exist this year. But there is also a recognition in the savings and debt plan, as best we can understand it, to say that for frontline workers, that they will still be able to grow beyond the cap. So particularly for those areas which are driven by patient numbers or student numbers in schools and health, there is likely to be the ability for employment numbers to continue to grow in line with those. Clearly, other parts of the public sector haven't had that capacity to do that through the government policies at the moment. So we've seen significant growth in demand in agencies, but not an increase in the number of staff to match that growth, particularly in places like child safety. So we don't think at this point in time that the government savings and debt plan has kind of radically changed that number. But the implementation of recruitment and selection processes is clearly significant in terms of this process, and there's some language in the publication about rebalancing the public service roles. So they're clearly, in light of the broader financial situation facing the state government post the kind of economic depression, recession that we're facing post the economic downturn from COVID, has had a major impact on the budget, on the budgetary situation for government, particularly moving forward in relation to future income streams. So in terms of that process, there is clearly some questions moving forward in relation to this. The savings and debt plan itself has, as we understand it, 6 or 7 subgroups within the government that are looking at implementation of different groups. So there's a group looking at ICT, there's a group looking at government accommodation, there's a group looking at marketing, and then there's another group looking at agency reviews, which we have less detail on. But in terms of what it means for public sector workers, what we think that the major component that is likely to have short-term implications is in relation to the workforce subgroup, which has been managed basically by the Public Service Board and the Public Service Commission. And as best we can understand it at this stage, there is a 4-step process that is likely to have different impacts in different agencies in relation to that process. So the stage 1, which is really, so the plan itself we think applies for 12 months. Stage 1 is in relation to the definitions. Then we look at how recruitment will occur post that definition process. So at stage 1, there is a requirement that the Public Service Board, which is a group of senior directors general in the central agencies, have to approve a definition of frontline. So historically, there's been some definitions about frontline support, corporate support, or other non-frontline groups for the purposes of the budget reporting, and also in terms of the Murray cap and how budget principle 6 was being applied over the last 4 or 5 years. Then there was, as part of the various reviews that have occurred, there was one of the reviews with the Bridgman review that we'll talk about later in terms of the public sector legislation. But there was a second review that occurred concurrently with that, but was finished earlier, which was conducted by Professor Peter Coldrake, that made some recommendations about the inappropriateness of the kind of absolute FTE cap, and started to recommend reporting around contractors, consultants and labour hire, which had exploded in the public sector as a result of the blunt FTE cap being applied. But also there was a question on the Goldrake around whether the definition of frontline versus frontline support was completely appropriate. And part of that process was a discussion around that. But what has happened in relation to the government's announcement of the savings and debt plan has been to require that the Public Service Board revisits a application of a definition of frontline. So the definition hasn't changed, but agencies have been required to put back submissions in relation to what they believe are frontline workers. So some of the larger agencies, particularly Queensland Health, have engaged with Together in relation to this, and that really looks at the issue of whether some of the groups that were previously defined as frontline support should be defined as frontline. So we know that at least we've had discussions with at least 2 major agencies about where this process is at. Our best understanding as at an hour and a half ago was that the submissions have been moved forward. Whether the Public Service Board is meeting as a group or whether it's been doing a fly minute isn't completely clear, but we expect that there is at least some of the agencies have got to the stage of having a redefinition and reapplication of the definition of frontline, and whether that's an expansion or a contraction, we know where the agencies are arguing to try and get a clarity around this, because clearly one of the issues in relation to the question about how does recruitment and selection occur during the savings and debt plan, one of the key decision-making criteria is about whether or not they're frontline. So that redefinition or the reapplication of the frontline definition won't necessarily be the same as the definition that was used in terms of frontline support or other or corporate support that existed 12, 18 months ago in relation to the Mori data reporting both to the PSC and also then in terms of the reporting in relation to some of the budget papers. And certainly Goldrake recommended, and I think was accepted by government, that should be a 6-monthly rather than quarterly reporting, but also to expand on what that data looks like. So what that really will mean in terms of that process is that the government is then going to be, agency by agency, is going to be required to make decisions about whether or not they fill jobs. And that's really something that has really been part of the culture within the public service for the last 5 years. But there will be a key decision point which government will make in relation to the decision of particularly for those areas outside of health where it's kind of been driven by patients or schools, by student numbers, the question about a vacancy occurring in relation to someone retiring or resigning from the public service. And so the question then will be, like, clearly this is already occurring in the public service, irrespective of the public service, the broader service and debt plan. The savings and debt plan is really occurring as we know agencies are realising that there is going to be significant financial pressure on once the budget does come down, and so there has been a significant pressure in relation to where temporary contracts are coming to an end, not extending those, but also in relation to where people are retiring or resigning or getting jobs elsewhere. There was a statement made by Minister Trad when she was Treasurer about the recruitment freeze, and that's had a knock-on effect without much detail into the sector. So that really has also been coming up an issue, and there hasn't really been much discussion about that there hasn't been a decision to reduce the FTE cap, but the ability to get jobs filled in the public sector over the last 6 months since the financial impact of COVID has been hit has really dramatically been a lot harder. But the savings and debt plan really then deals with issues in relation to how recruitment will occur. The original kind of document from Treasury, which we showed you earlier, we can provide copies of, people are interested in, talks about looking at internal recruitment. but in terms of what that looks like at an agency level, but the real issue kind of comes to a head in this space about best case understanding in relation to this process is that appears to be just in the same way that the original FTE cap forced significant movements to labour hire on contractors as government departments had money, had work that had to be done, but couldn't get the approvals within government to employ people. So we had an anthropologist and a range of people being employed as labour hire because the work was vital, needed to be undertaken, and the budget was available, but there wasn't an FTE capacity to do it. So what we think the outcome of the current process is there's going to, the proposals as put to us by the central agencies and by agencies in discussion is there appears to be a significant variation between frontline and non-frontline, but also a significant variation between permanent and temporary. And so we're seeing a reversion to the situation that really occurred at the beginning of the FTE cap kind of period, where there will be significant capacity for agency, a significant difference between where an agency can employ someone on a temporary basis will require a much lower level delegation than the ability to employ someone on a permanent basis, and also the ability to employ someone on a labour hire basis will be completely exempt from the broader requirements as we understand them at this stage within the savings and debt plan. And what has also been significantly missing in all of this has been the requirements under the various industrial collective agreements, whether it's in health, education or the core, as to the requirements around what that looks like in terms of industrial consultation. So the implementation has really been completely silent on those issues. And what we best understand at this point is that there is going to be a three style of approach. That the Bridgman review talked a lot about the system managers, and that appears to have been adopted into the savings and debt plan. There is some confusion about this point based on some meetings I had this morning and yesterday afternoon, but the advice that we had as at from the Public Service Commission most recently was that there will be a different level of delegation to the system manager who is the Director General of Education, the Director General of Health, and then who the system manager is and who has the delegated responsibilities within the other part isn't as clear. I think at this stage it is likely to be the Public Service Commissioner rather than the Director General of the department, or in the case of Queensland Police, the Police Commissioner. So what the savings and debt plan at this point in time would require is that if there is a permanent position to be filled, which is frontline, it requires the service, the system manager to have approval. So if there's a requirement to fill a frontline position in Queensland Health, it requires the Director General's approval. If it's a frontline position in Education Queensland, it requires the approval of the DG of Education. In terms of then the system, who will sign off on the front line within the public service, the briefing that we were provided was that would be a system manager. So that would be the Public Service Commissioner would be required to sign off on the appointment, the ability to recruit permanently to public service positions outside of health and outside of education, including the Queensland Police Force. So that is a significant variation, and obviously is going to be a significant issue in terms of timeliness, but also the ability to ensure that services are being delivered, but also a significant issue in relation to whether or not there is the ability for manageable workloads, particularly with high staff turnover, areas of turnover such as child safety, even if they are defined as front line to the child safety officers. The question really comes down to the ability to have a timely ability to fill those jobs and make sure that services are maintained and workloads don't go through the roof. The issue, though, is more complicated and worse potentially for those areas who are not defined as frontline. So if those positions are frontline support, So an AO2 in the child safety area office is frontline support under the current definition. We haven't seen a revised definition, revised applications definition since the savings and debt plan came down. But in terms of that process, what the proposal, the announcements as we've been briefed on them is that would require a central government approval. So the child safety office, the child safety officer, the person, if a vacancy was there, if it's going to be required to be filled on a permanent basis, someone resigns as a permanent vacancy, it's within the FTE cap, would require the Public Service Commission approval to get sign off. The AO2 who works with staffs the front counter, and clearly in terms of that process is a significant player in terms of the ability to manage the workloads and makes a fundamental contribution to the ability to provide quality services to the Queensland community and keep children safe. That is a non-frontline position at the moment. It's a frontline support position. The advice we were provided is that will require a CBRC, a Cabinet Budget Committee review approval to be filled. Clearly, that is a ridiculous position if that actually is the way the savings and debt plan is going to be implemented. That was the way it was put to us at the briefings by the Public Service Commission about a week ago, or less than a week ago. But that would, like, in terms of that process, the CBRC is the five senior ministers, the Premier, the Deputy Premier, the Treasurer, and two other ministers. That's the group that basically makes the budgetary decisions in an industrial sense. It's the one that signs off on collective bargaining outcomes. And we've seen some of the major problems we faced in places like Queensland Health this year has been the inability to get the CBRC processes are done in a timely fashion to sign off on offers to 50,000 workers and then sign off on the fact that those deals have been put in place. So that became a hugely problematic process, and that resulted, when we were talking about 50,000 workers, that was still a challenge in terms of the internal process within government to have timely decisions made in a way that didn't damage workers' lives. And so we're gravely concerned at this point in time that the ability of that group to consider in a timely fashion the need for an AO2 in the Mackay area office for child safety to be filled is highly unlikely. What we would be seeing in real terms is that the decision in relation to that process is that particularly for higher level positions, AO5s, AO6s, it's likely that the government would be able to go through a tiered process of decision making. And if they make a decision that they want to fill internally through kind of internal government processes, and that's not completely clear how that would happen, that would be able to be filled. And so therefore, on a promotional basis, you might get an AO4 getting an AO5 position through an internal selection process, which would then mean that we get that 5 position filled quickly. But the knock-on effect from that will be that the base level positions are the ones that remain unfilled, because you're not going to be able to fill an AO2 position internally because there isn't positions like that. That's really the entry level positions. And so therefore we're going to be faced with this situation under the current proposals that would see that the base level positions or other positions potentially for non-frontline are likely to be AO2s because the child safety officers themselves would be probably a different approval process would require CBRC approval. So that's either going to mean government departments are faced with large-scale vacancies in those high turnover areas, or they're going to use labour hire or temporary contracts, or if they're going to end up having to be, if there was support for permanent positions, that they're able to that process, but we are going to work that process through, and then we're going to have a kind of complete grinding of a halt to public sector recruitment processes as part of that process. So that is going to be a significant challenge for us, and what we are seeking to do through that process is really engage with government at a whole of government level to say that this process is broken as it's currently designed. That in terms of the ability to try and see the mechanics of, like, we understand and recognise that the current budgetary circumstances mean that government is going to be thinking carefully about recruitment. But the model being put forward in terms of the savings and debt plan, at one level, the savings debt plan is talking about, in a positive sense, that the cap shouldn't apply to frontline, and that should be about being recruited. It's also positive in that it talks about internal recruitment being a priority, which we think is a step in the right direction. It talks about having to review labour hire contractors and consultants, which we've been saying for a long time should be direct employees. But the unintended consequence of the proposal being put forward at the moment is really going to be driving towards a process of higher level of temporary employment, higher level of labour hire, which are the two things the government has been saying they wanted to move towards permanency. When they introduced the wages freeze, they said it was about reducing permanency, was about increasing permanency. What we're going to see in this process is the exact reverse of that. But it also, we will be seeking engagement at the agency level, not for the sector-wide level. We'll try and fix the system. At the agency level, what we'll be really trying to give workers a voice in through your agency consultative committees, through your delegate structures, is around what does this look like in terms of what will the frontline definition look like? Has that changed, so we get an understanding of the areas which are most at risk during this process? Secondly, if agencies are going to be looking at trying to cancel long-term temporary contracts, what's going to happen to those workers and why that's occurring, but also where vacancies are occurring because of retirements, resignations, or internal promotions. What's going to, if the agency isn't going to be filling those jobs, what's going to happen to that work? To make sure that the decisions around the failure to allow recruitment to occur doesn't end up being a huge workload crisis within the public sector, as turnover will not be consistent. And if work units have 3 or 4 people leave out of 10, it's going to be practically impossible for the 7 remaining staff to kind of have effectively a doubling of their workload because of the failure of that process. So we need to be forcing a conversation around workload at the same time as a conversation around the filling of the jobs. And thirdly, to engage with government at the agency level as well, to find out, to pick up the reporting requirements around labour hire contractors and consultants, but also to make sure that the broader savings plan approach doesn't result in a dramatic increase in the number of labour hire and temporary contracts, and to make sure that this process is neutral to the point of permanency. So therefore, that the ability to continue to recruit permanent public servants occurs in a timely and meaningful fashion, particularly in the lead up to caretaker mode, where government generally grinds to a halt and there is a greater reluctance to make decisions of importance. That it's not the public sector workers who cop that by the fact of increased workloads and a high vacancy rate, but also to make sure that we're able to defend the services that we deliver to the public by maximising the number of positions being filled. Otherwise, we'll end up with a default kind of reduction in the size of the sector without any meaningful conversation about what that means in terms of the process. So in terms of that, we've had some urgent meetings with government about this. We've put back to government, and we'll be putting back to government today and on Monday, the faults within the design of the system that really are going to mean, particularly outside of Queensland Health and outside of education, significant challenges about recruitment of frontline, but also real potential challenges depending on the definition of frontline for non-frontline workers, and make sure that the strategy moving forward in terms of that process really is driven. So I know we're running, I did try to keep this to half an hour, but that's really where we're at with a debt plan. And we'll be also talking to the agencies and seeking consultation through your agency consultant committees, through your delegate structures, to try and look at how do we mitigate the implementation of that process, but have a real worker voice around what is frontline, how do vacancies get filled, what happens to workloads and those associated issues. And then more broadly, in terms of the public sector reform piece that we spoke to you at length about last time, the union has put their submission in based on your feedback and the survey that members filled in. That submission went in last Friday. We've got an extension for 1 day. The parliamentary committee hearing is next Monday, and I'll be appearing along with Kate Flanders, the Assistant Secretary, and James Swan, the Vice President from the Public Service Division, to prosecute our argument in relation to what that looks like. And in terms of that process, I think some of the key outcomes of the member survey, and there'll be a follow-up about giving you an opportunity to get a copy of the union submission on Monday, really is about the failure of the directives to really provide real certainty to workers, and we need to make sure that the legislation goes further and picks up more of the detail of the directives, but also to make sure we deal with issues about long-term hire duties, because the legislation really doesn't move far enough in relation to beyond the transitional phase, to make sure there's long-term commitments about that, to make sure that workers don't have insecure income as opposed to insecure employment, but also to make sure the rights around discipline, investigations and whatever are also ingrained in the legislation rather than the directives, where there is real risks of those things being watered down by future Public Service Commission directives without the oversight of Parliament. And we'll also be wanting to seek to have the legislation applied to those parts of the public sector who don't currently have the protections of the Public Service Act. Not necessarily make people public servants, but to give them those protections. That really is going to be about work cover, TAFE Queensland, and a range of areas which have significant challenges by not having those same legislative provisions. So in terms of that process, we are going to need your involvement and your support to make that happen. We want to engage with the Parliamentary Committee in our formal submissions next week, but no matter how well myself or James or Kate argue that case in the hearing on Monday, it's really going to be about the ability of you as workers and your colleagues as workers to make your voice heard over the next 6 weeks, to make sure that not only are the good parts of this legislation enacted before the election, but we try and get the committee and then the governments to go further than is currently proposed, to give more workers' rights to those, more access to those rights, but also to improve the legislative basis of your rights rather than the directive basis. And also to look at issues such as consultation and other issues. So really, that's really where we're going to get to over the next couple of weeks. I know we've had a couple of people, some members getting some challenges around accessing our Zoom. So we will be making this video available to those people who weren't able to access it live today. We'll also send out an email this afternoon if you've got questions or want further information about this. We've got a really good turnout today, but we do need to try and get more members and non-members able to access this information through these sort of Zooms and trying to do them better. So if you've got feedback about what to do next time, please help and give us that feedback this afternoon. But after the submission, the hearing on Monday, I'll report back to you on Monday afternoon. And really, it's going to be about getting more involved in the campaign, making sure your voice is heard, because as a collective voice, you are far stronger than anything Kate or I can say or James can say on your behalf. We need you to be loud, we need you to be vocal, and we need you to demand a better go from the Parliamentary Committee and from the broader Parliament to make sure this legislation is as good as it can be. It gives you the rights that you deserve and gives you the rights to other public sector workers who don't currently have it. So I know I tried to stay to half an hour. I'm 5 minutes over, which is better than last time, but we will try and get out an email this afternoon. I'm sorry if I haven't covered all of your questions. I'm sorry if it's a bit confusing, but there is more questions there are answers at this stage. But we will be prosecuting this case, and we will need your support both in terms of legislation, but also about holding agencies accountable and the government accountable about the savings and debt plan. So get involved in your consultative committees, and please make sure that you're talking to your fellow workers about this, and also talking about some of the other issues we didn't get a chance to talk about today in terms of the return to work arrangements, the return to office arrangements, and some of those other things that are clearly critical issues. And we'll try and do another one of these report back Zooms in about a week and a half's time. We tried to do them normally on a Wednesday, but today we had to do Friday, given the critical meetings that we had yesterday and this morning that we wanted to report back on. So I'm sorry I speak too fast, but we try to get as much as possible. And thank you very much for taking the time to participate. Please get more involved. Please, if you have suggestions about how to do this better, please let us know in today's follow-up email. But make sure you stay active, you stay involved, you stay informed, because that's the only way we'll make sure that we're able to get the best outcome we can out of this legislation, and also make sure in terms of how we engage with the government about their savings and debt plan, that it's not about penalising public sector workers or the service that you provide, because your work is too important to the Queensland community to be compromised by that ham-fisted implementation process. So thanks very much for everybody. And if there are questions, put them in the chat, or preferably we'll send out an email later this afternoon to try and get to everybody we can. But we know that we've got about 150 people or so, 180 people online earlier today. So thanks everybody, and I'll hopefully talk to you very soon again. Thank you for your time.